Welcome to the latest lecture in the Corporate Governance and Social Accountability course concerning agency and stewardship theories. We have 3 learning outcomes for today, or for this session. First, you need to be able to define the principal-agent problem and to understand what a principal is and what an agent is. You need to understand and explain the underlying economic theory that underpins this region and this area. It's very important. There is some very good fundamental economics here, but some of it is flawed in the standard neoclassical neoliberal model. And therefore, from that, you must understand the critiques of this, why people believe in it, why people do not believe in it. It's significant that you understand that there are alternative theories, which is one that we'll look at specifically today is stewardship, but also to understand that the fact there are examples of people behaving like agents does not prove that agency theory is correct. Agency theory at heart states that all people are agents. Producing one example of people that act like agency does not prove agency theory. This fundamental error is one that is made by people throughout the international political economic system. So I'm hoping it's one that you will avoid. So what we're going to be looking at is the readings to support this series of lectures. They are by William H. Meckling, Michael C. Jensen, Kathleen Eisenhart, and Eugene F. Fama, all of them leading US management business theorists. And I do urge you to take a look at what they have written, which is available on the reading list. The core idea, the fundamental economic principle that underlies agency cost, agency theory, agency principles, is that of transaction costs. If you remember, we talked about Chandler pretty much ignoring transaction costs when he organised his M form or believed in his M form. Well, fundamentally, we're introducing transaction costs. So firstly, let's deal with this simply. What is a transaction cost? It's based on Williamson and Coase's work, and they actually introduced to economics the idea of transaction cost because neoclassical economics actually ignored it, believed that all transactions were fundamentally costless. And that is one of the reasons why, as we noted under the previous set of lectures, that Adam Smith himself believed that most people would be self-employed because there would be no cost to them forming and breaking relationships and then forming new relationships. They just do that as and when required. But we've started to believe, and it's one of those things that actually when you think about it seems quite self-evident, that there is a transaction cost incurred whenever there's an economic exchange. A good example of this is those of you who own stocks and shares. So if you want to buy a stock, you need to pay a commission to a broker. If you want to sell a stock, you need to pay a commission to a broker. That commission is a transaction cost, i.e. you get nothing for it except the transaction taking place. It does not contribute in any other way to the profitability of the deal. So again, self-evidently perhaps, it is very important when you rationally evaluate any transaction you wish to undertake, what are the costs of doing the transaction? Does the profit from the transaction result in making the transaction worth doing? It's surprising how many people don't do this. My own personal experience of dealing with anyone who decides to manage their own financial investments is that they're constantly buying and selling shares and saying, oh, my share's gone up by $3, I've made this money, but actually pointing out that they've actually spent far more than that on transaction costs, and actually their overall portfolio is going down in value despite that they believe themselves to be picking and choosing good shares. So it's very important. It's actually difficult in practice for people to take these transaction costs on board. On a lesser scale, the number of people who perhaps travel long distance. My wife travel miles and miles to get a great bargain, but having spent far more on diesel and time in getting this cheap bargain than she could have done if she'd paid extra down the road. And myself recently, when installing a new boiler, and my builder said, oh, let's go out and have a look around. I can probably get it for like £70 cheaper at this place. But that would require me to take him and one of his lads off the job, for us to drive off in his van, for us to load the van in, put it in the back. So I said, no, I'll pay the extra £70. and it'll keep you and your lads working here for a day. And it was actually much cheaper for me to have the boiler pay slightly more and have it delivered than it would have been to pay the master builder and two of his guys to be going around delivering it. So once you understand transaction costs, you can actually save yourself quite a bit of money in certain circumstances. There are three basic types of transaction costs. There are search and information costs, and this is the idea that you actually go out and need to do something in order to find out whether something is the best purchase. So, for instance, in one way, search and information costs might be as simple as comparing prices. This takes time. It's worked to the principle that, of course, time is money. And the reality is that there are many things that we do not fundamentally cost, but which have a cost. There are times when we spent doing something which could be spent doing something else. Of course, one of the big lowers of search and information costs has been the internet. And there are a number now of supermarkets who will actually undertake some of these for you and will offer to refund if you spend more money at them than you would have spent at other things. Of course, there are caveats and ways of getting away from this the supermarkets do, but basically they're attempting to take the search and information costs out of a transaction deal. The famous meerkats, of which I own about 10, have also been very good in bringing down the price of search and information costs and other comparison websites. There was a time when I would actually really probably only change my insurance every 2 or 3 years. Now, every year I change my insurance, partly because I want a new meerkat, partly because, and mostly because, I can actually have very few search and information costs in doing so. There are bargaining costs that may again simply be time or the emotional price of arguing with somebody about supplies. But if it's a major investment, or if it's something, for instance, such as negotiating contract at work, or if it's a union negotiated contract for a large number of people, there can be quite a lot of costs involved, such as politics, lawyers, economics, etc. All these people need to be recruited, needing to actually get on with doing their job, needing to be paid. And then, of course, you draw up the appropriate contract, and it works on both sides. The other side of the arm will also need to do some. And the final thing, the policing and enforcement costs. It's no good having the world's most perfect contract if, in the end, you cannot get that contract enforced. And this can be a major expense in some things. And it also can reflect on whether or not it's worth going through all the other things. What is it worth spending a fortune bargaining for a decent contract if you know in the end that contract will not be enforced? So what does the term transaction cost even mean? Where does it come from? The actual phrase is believed to have been coined by Ronald Coase. So it is claimed it was coined by Ronald Coase. He was developing a theoretical framework, actually trying to work out a very simple question. Adam Smith believed that everybody would work independently and would just get together collectively, specialised, as he talked about in the Wealth of Nations, as independent contractors. And then they would take a share of the market. But actually, what happened was the market stopped doing all these things. And as we've seen in the Chandler argument, eventually they subcontracted, they formed the M form, they specialised in the tasks, and people started to be employed by firms. And Coase was trying to work out what causes this. Why is it that people go against the fundamentals of the free market? Why is it that some people decide to work for firms and decide to work internally? And they came up with their basic argument that what happened was that if the cost was greater to set up a contract to do a job external to a firm, you would then look to bring it inside the firm where there would still be transaction costs, but these would be lower because they would be covered by a general employment contract, a general rules of behaviour, general monitoring control. There'd be nothing specific for each particular one. However, despite this belief, Coase did not actually use the term transaction cost. He actually used the phrase costs of using the price mechanism, and this is 91st ever paid for the nature of the firm. Note this, the costs of using the price mechanism. As late as 1937, it was still fundamentally not understood why anyone had bothered to set up these firms, when in fact everyone should have been working independently. And so he didn't even have a phrase or word for it. And this is where he first discussed the concept that became transaction costs. Indeed, Oliver Williamson's fundamental thesis regarding transaction cost economics has become so widely accepted, it is no longer just used in economics. In fact, there are many places it's used. Obviously, It's quite clear now if you're purchasing any product, which in this case buying a vehicle, there are elements of transaction costs involved in order to make sure it's clear, such as paying, for instance, paying the AA to do a series of pre-vehicle checks to make sure that the vehicle is actually intact. The less you're willing to spend on transaction cost economics, the less you're willing to spend on the transaction, the more likely the transaction is to go wrong. Purchasing a used vehicle is a classic example of that. You have to balance how much money should I spend on checking out this car with how much money will I lose if I just go ahead and use the car. There's all sorts. The simplest transactions here. Lemonade for 10 cents is fine because the time these children are putting into the lemonade is not something to be costed. However, if an adult was doing this, the amount of lemonade they'd have to sell to cover their economic rent of what the money they could make doing something else becomes greater. Therefore, transaction cost economics have to be taken into account when making any business decision or making any decision about employment, etc. And this goes on. So it's gift giving. What do you get in return for a gift? People often balance with transaction cost economics these days, saying actually a gift economy can work. Effectively, if you give one person a gift and then there's an expectation of gifts in return, what is expected in the gifts, etc. And this way, it is often used to explain why gifts are given in the first place. And that the return may not be financial, may not be strictly speaking economic. There are many things that we can hope to receive in return for a gift, including simply making ourselves feel better. And across the board in evolution, it's said that actually the unconscious decision, and I use the word decision, it's not decision of course, but a mutation will continue if the cost of that mutation, for instance, the cost of building a bigger brain, which is very expensive in biological terms, but the return it gives is sufficient to make it worthwhile, which is how various primates have evolved as they go along, and other animals have evolved. It can be very, very difficult. There's great expense, for instance, involved in the peacock's tail. But because of the great expense involved in the peacock's tail, this means that the peacock who has the most beautiful tail attracts more mates and is more likely to continue on to the next generation. Therefore, the biological expense in building a tail is considered to be worthwhile. Of course, having realized that transaction costs are a major driver of decisions, one thing we need to know is how much are they likely to be? And Williamson identified 5 drivers in the actual level of transaction costs. Frequency. If you had to do something a lot, it was a lot cheaper per time that you did it. You could spread the costs over doing it. So if you're getting many people to sign the same simple contract, you write it once, use many times. If it's a situation in which you have to do a one-off, maybe purchasing something you do not purchase regularly, so for instance, transaction costs in buying a car are higher than the transaction costs in buying a tin of beans, then you would expect the price to be higher the less frequent it is. Specificity. How specific is it? Buying a car is very specific. Buying groceries is similar to other purchases of groceries. Buying beans is the same as buying soup. So the more specific it is, the higher the transaction costs involved in that transaction are going to be. Uncertainty. You pretty much know beans are cheap. You can know where you're going to get them from. You pretty much know what the quality is going to be. But when again, used cars are a classic example for why cost of transaction can be very high, because the level of uncertainty involved with purchasing that. If you're buying a new car, you may feel there's less uncertainty involved, because even if the car doesn't work, it's much easier to get your money back a replacement. Limited rationality. You may believe you're acting very rationally, the other person may believe they're acting very rationally, but if you remember your basic managerial business economics, we all have limited rationality. We all have things that make ourselves less rational. And this pushes up transaction costs because we're more likely to work on gut rather than to work logically. And how opportunistic are there again? I mean, obviously, the more that somebody's likely to try and exploit you, try and rip you off, the more expensive that transaction is likely to be. So how do we go about limiting them? Well, many economists ask what is the best way of doing things. And that is why people go from working for themselves to working for other companies. Do we set up a firm? Do we actually go out into the market rather than building it? Do we franchise the costs? All of these are ways actually of minimizing the transaction costs of any particular good or service. And what sort of contract is involved will be one of the main things that dictates what sort of relationship you decide to set up within any given transaction.